Hello, everyone. My name is Justin D. Jenkins, managing editor for the Quintessential Gentleman, and I'm here with CNN political commentator and New York Times bestselling author Keith Boykin. Keith, how are you?
I'm doing well.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you for sitting with us. I really appreciate the chat. You've been such a champion for our community and how we look at politics and how we view politics for a while now and created this space. Was the goal always to kind of be a politician, or you knew you kind of wanted to follow this journey?
I don't, I know. Oh, wow. I don't even know what to say. The goal was not to be a politician per se, although when I was much younger, I did think about that, but not as an adult. I worked for lots of politicians, and I worked for a president, and that was enough to convince me I didn't want to do that. At least not in my own life. I thought about it later on again once in life about running for Congress, and then I decided I didn't want to do that either. But no, I like the freedom I have to be able to talk about politics without having to be bound by sort of a political party or ideology, or just I can sort of say and think what I want and grow and evolve as I want. So I think electoral politics is a noble, worthy profession, but it's not for me right now.
Right. Now you have an interesting story. When you was in law school, you actually, during a protest, chased the dean at the time to have a conversation. Looking back, what was going on through your mind? And do you think that that was the moment that kind of set the tone for your career that you've built?
Well, yeah, I was in law school. I was a first year student, and we were having a protest outside a faculty meeting for diversity. We were advocating for diversity. The dean walked out. I saw him, called out to him. He ignored me. So I followed him out the door. And when he saw me coming, he started sprinting across the campus to get away from me. So I started sprinting across the campus to catch up with him. And then a photographer from the Boston Globe took a picture of me chasing the dean across the campus. And I think I became sort of infamous on campus or famous on campus as a result of that moment when the photo was published. But I think it also helped to introduce me to activism in a way that I only sort of dealt with sort of secondarily before, because I'd been a journalist in college. I was the editor of my school newspaper when there's a lot of protests going on, and I watched the whole thing up front, but I wasn't actually on the front lines as an activist. And so then in law school, I find myself in the other role where I'm not just a journalist, but I'm actually the person who's leading the fight. And I think my role as a journalist helped to inform me about some of the things that I did as an activist. But it kind of put me on a trajectory of always fighting the fight, the good fight, of speaking truth to power, which is something that people talk a lot about. But when you're chasing the dean of the Harvard Law School across the campus, that is literally speaking truth to power.
Yeah.
And just reminded me that sometimes we have a lot more power than we realize. Especially when you're young, when you're a student, when you're a person of color, when you're LGBTQ, when you're a person who has different background, different ethnicity, different sort of life experience. All those different things can make people feel marginalized. And I think one of the things I learned is that even the most marginalized among us, it may be hard to realize, but we have power when we use our voices and speak up and stand up and speak up for truth.
Yeah, definitely. Now, who was it that kind of instilled that fight in you when you like growing up and you went to law school and things that you were doing?
Well, it wasn't necessarily any particular individual. I think, it's a weird thing that I say to people because it feels like a horoscope type of thing. But,
Yeah.
I'm a Virgo and I was born on August 28th. And that's also the anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous I Have a Dream speech. So I remember when I was very young as a child hearing about that and realizing I was born on the same day as Dr. King's famous speech and thinking there must be a reason behind this. It must be because I'm supposed to be involved in civil rights or something. And so I've always kind of connected with that, with not just the speech and with Dr. King, but with just the message of trying to make a difference. So it's been a lifelong experience. I don't think there's any one individual I can point to. Like I said, I was influenced by Dr. King's works and also Malcolm X and many others, but no individual in particular. It's just sort of the feeling of being an outsider, I think, more than anything else, and feeling like somebody needs to speak up for the outsiders.
Definitely. Now, you lived in a lot of different cities. Have that kind of changed the way of how you write and what you write about, being
I
exposed
think
to so much culture?
I think so, because I always tell people to travel or get out of where they live at some point in their lives, just to do something different if they can. And I know it's a luxury for many of us, but I went to three different high schools, and that wasn't ideal by any means, but it also got me a chance early on to sort of see people in different experiences. And I went to high school in Florida and in St. Louis, Missouri. And then I went to college in New Hampshire, law school in Boston, lived in LA and San Francisco and DC and Little Rock, Arkansas and Miami, and currently live in Atlanta and currently live in New York. And I feel like having all those different perspectives from north, south, east, west, midwest, and actually lived overseas for a little bit as well, it kind of tells me in some ways we're all very much the same.
Yeah.
But in other ways, we have peculiarities and differences among us that need to be recognized and appreciated. So a lot of times when people talk about diversity in America, they use this sort of old-fashioned, I think, melting pot analogy, and we're all supposed to blend into this one
Yeah.
thing, which I've always hated. I think Jesse Jackson years ago used sort of salad bowl analogy as a better example. Because if you
Yeah.
have a salad, you don't just want everything that tastes like lettuce.
Yeah.
Sometimes you want spinach in there, you want tomatoes, or you
Yeah.
want mushrooms, or broccoli, or carrots, or cheese, or dressing, or croutons, or whatever. All those things contribute to the flavor.
Yeah.
And you don't necessarily have to have all of those things, but without all of those things, you don't get the same sort of richness of experience. And you create this sort of bland thing. And I think some people want to have a blandness, a bland America, where we're all just sort of become this one thing. We don't have any culture. We don't have any sort of individuality. We don't see color, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I think that's ridiculous. I think part of what makes us special is our differences, our uniqueness. It doesn't have to separate us. It can actually unite us if we start to appreciate those differences.
Definitely, definitely. Now, your latest book, Race Against Time: The Politics of Darkening America. Why was this now the perfect time to have this work?
Have you seen what's going on in this country? This is crazy right now.
Yeah.
The past 5 years, I've never seen anything like this in my lifetime in America. I mean, not from the election of Trump, which was just extraordinary in itself, and the second time in my lifetime when the person who did not win the popular vote ended up winning the presidency. That's a huge, major problem with our Constitution, our government, right there from the bat. Then the
Yeah.
person's elected as this racist, misogynist, homophobic, xenophobic, just bigot who,
Yeah.
despite the fact that he didn't win the popular vote, governs like he's some sort of autocrat, like he's got the dictatorial powers of a leader from a different country, a different generation, and it was just all unbelievably hateful. The attacks on the NFL players, the attacks on the Congressional Black Caucus members, the attacks on the black members who were part of the four members of the quote unquote squad, the attacks on cities that he didn't like Detroit and other places, the refusal to accept the election results, the encouragement and incitement of an insurrection, saying that the people in Charlottesville were all good, were very fine people on both
Yeah.
sides. The fact that he spent 5.5 years lying about the previous president's birth certificate and spent 30 years lying about the exonerated Central Park Five.
Yeah.
That man had no business ever being anywhere close to the White House. And even
Yeah.
after 4 years of that, 74 million people still voted for him. After everything we went through, even after the end, when we had a pandemic that took the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, and he pretended like it wasn't even happening. That was just unbelievably chaotic and catastrophic. And our country just barely survived that. But the central point, the central issue, the central reason why this is happening is about race. People, white people, not all, but many white people are deathly afraid of the darkening of America. They see we had a black president for 8 years. They see we have a black woman vice president now. They say we had a woman who ran for president, got more votes than the white man who quote unquote defeated her. Um, they see that we have marriage equality in all 50 states. They see that the Hispanic population will become the majority in the next 3 decades in 5 states. They see that the Asian American population is growing more rapidly than any other segment of the country. They see the statistics that show that the white population will no longer be the majority of this country by 2044. And they see the latest Census Bureau report, which is showing that the white population is actually declining for the first time in Census Bureau history. All those things are scaring the hell out of white people. And they're doing everything they can to stay in power. And they're doing everything they can at the micro level and the macro level. The micro level, they're busy fighting us. They're trying to literally lynch us. That's what the Ahmaud Arbery trial is about. That's what the whole George Floyd story is all about. The Breonna Taylor story. All these different stories that are in the news are all about white privilege, and not just police brutality, but about white supremacy and white privilege. But then at the macro level, they're passing all these laws to make it harder for us to vote. They're doing everything they can to make sure they can stay in power, pushing through judges who will be there for decades to prevent and knock down any sort of change that people try to push through. They're holding on to this old filibuster rule, which is not even in the Constitution, to make sure they can have a minority rule. And they won't allow statehood for DC, which they're afraid will be, two black senators elected. This is so overt. It's so obvious what they're doing. They are doing everything in their power to stay entrenched so that they don't have to give up any sort of power to black and brown people.
Definitely. And you listed all of the kind of the changes that's happening, the tactics that's coming up because of those changes. Is this what disruption will look like? And do we have to go through this in order to disrupt? Like, what do you tell the person who sees this and they start losing hope?
Well, I've never been one to give up just because things are bad. I've always believed that when things are bad, that means we're supposed to be more dedicated to fighting the fight. There's an old slogan, which is from, I think it was an army or something. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. Okay. Is that the army or the military? Somewhere in the military.
Yeah.
From back in the 80s or 90s or whatever, I don't know. But and I know it's stupid and cliche at the same time. I do feel like when things get rough, that's when it's we must rise to the challenge. Things are rough now. We have to rise to the challenge. We can't just sit here and say, "Oh, it's horrible. It's gonna go to hell," and we can't do anything about it.
Right.
I mean, what would have happened if Dr. King had taken that attitude, or Rosa Parks had taken that attitude, or Frederick Douglass, or Sojourner Truth, or Harriet Tubman? At each point in our history, we've had difficult circumstances. We suffered through slavery for hundreds of years and segregation for 100 years. We've had difficult points in our history as Black people, but at each point, Black people did not give up. Even when it seemed almost impossible. There was a time when it was almost unthinkable that they would ever abolish slavery. Yeah. We had to fight a civil war and lose 600,000 Americans just to get rid of slavery in this country. And even then, there was a resistance to it after the fact. And segregation persisted for 100 years after that. So if we can fight those evils, we can certainly fight against what's going on in our country, but we have to be determined and willing to meet the challenge.
Yep, I agree. And you start the book with Our Weary Year, and you talk about your trip in Mexico at the end of 2019, and you kind of, saw this evolution in Mexico and was having a good time. And then you say, I interpreted my New Year's Eve adventure as a sign that years ahead might also be filled with exhilarating new experiences, but perhaps I considered later it was actually an omen that I would soon find myself in jail. Why was it important for you to start your book this way? And can you kind of just walk us through that experience?
Well, the book is divided in three parts, as you know. The first part is about 2020. The second part is about how we got to 2020, where I go back in history to the present. And the third part is about where do we go from here? How do we move forward after 2020? And I use 2020, of course, because it was a devastating year. We had a racial justice crisis, an economic crisis, a public health crisis, and a crisis of democracy, all in this one year. Never seen anything like this in the history of our country. So it's a monumental year. And it was also the beginning of the year in Mexico City, literally on January 1st, 2020 at 12:00 a.m. I found myself in a former women's prison in Mexico City, which wasn't where I was thinking I was going to be, but I was at a New Year's Eve into this party, which I hadn't made it into yet. And it just felt like such an odd place to begin 2020. Like here I am in the hallway of a former women's prison at the beginning of the year. And it only occurred to me later that this would become a metaphor from my own experience in 2020, coming back from Mexico and finding myself uh, seriously ill for several weeks, wondering if I might have some sort of dangerous disease. It never even occurred to me that COVID was a possibility at that time because it was
Yeah.
only the first month of 2020. Um, B, finding myself locked up for 3 months, if you will, in in lockdown quarantine like everyone else in America, living with my mom in Texas, even though I'm a New Yorker, but living with my mom in Texas because her husband passed away the first week of COVID. And then C, while covering a Black Lives Matter protest here in Harlem, I found myself arrested by the police just for doing my job as a journalist, covering a protest on the street. And the police took me away, put me in jail for 6 hours. And it was a reflection of why people were protesting in the first place. The fact that the police have this much power, the fact that police killed George Floyd, sat on his back and his neck for 9 minutes, the fact that they'd killed Breonna Taylor, the fact that Ahmaud Arbery wasn't killed by the police, but the police didn't do anything about it until months of protests from people forced them to take action about it.
Yeah.
And here they were again, the police overstepping their power, just throwing people in jail, throwing a black man in jail who happened to be covering a protest about Black Lives Matter. So I just think it was a reflection of just how our country had reached this inflection point. And it also gave the former president an opportunity to launch this attack on democracy. He tear gassed the protesters outside the White House just so he could hold up a Bible for a photo op outside a church he doesn't attend. And then when the final election results came, he wouldn't even accept the results of the election. And the very first thing he did, he didn't just say the whole election was fraudulent. He targeted black cities. He's targeted Detroit, Michigan, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Atlanta, Georgia in particular. Those were the places he said where the fraud was happening.
Yeah.
Just coincidentally happened to be the places where black people tend to live. So I mean, it was just so obvious and so disgusting and so disappointing that so many people in the white mainstream and the white mainstream media refused to acknowledge what was going on.
Yeah, and how important does media play when it comes to that? Because you do mention it's about 2020, how we got here and where we go after. If you can sum it up, how did we get to 2020? Because a part of me do think a lot of times it's a lot of things going on in the news cycle. We turn blind eyes. And I told people, even with the former president, his attack on democracy, I started seeing certain tweets when he was already attacking the post office and saying certain things with mail-in ballots that no one kind of reported on. And that's how he kind of made his way to spread the lies that he spread. So when we got to 2020, can you sum it up of how we got there?
You said it all. I mean, the truth is we have to listen to black people. We are the canary in the coal mine. We are the ones warning America, this is not right. This is not normal. This is dangerous. And they're just whistling along, pretending like this is not even happening. We didn't say anything. They're like,
Yeah.
oh, you darkies don't know what you're talking about. You're just always raising.
Right. Yeah.
And how do you not see it when the guy spent 30 years lying about the Central Park Five, 5.5 years lying about the first black president? He comes to his campaign. The first thing he does is he attacks Mexicans and said they're not bringing their best.
Yeah.
They're sending rapists and drug dealers. And then he attacks Muslims and says he wants a whole total ban on Muslims coming into the country. What else do you think is going to happen when you elect somebody like that? You think he's just going to come in and be a normal president? Of course. And every step of the way, people try to normalize his irregular behavior. They try to pretend like, oh, it's not that bad, or, he's getting better, he's growing the job. He just became president today because he gave a simple speech. It was astounding to me how many of us in Black America were sounding the alarm from the very beginning, and so many people in white America refused to acknowledge what we were saying until we end up with a pandemic with with millions of people infected and hundreds of thousands dead, until we end up with the worst economic crisis in nearly 100 years, until we end up with the worst democratic crisis in our country in 150 years, then suddenly people wake up and say, well, maybe he wasn't such a great president. Maybe that was a threat to democracy. Duh, what do you think we've been trying to tell you all along? And so I think that the reality is how we got to 2020 is that white America consistently and repeatedly has prioritized what I call peace between white people over justice for black people. This has been our country's history since the very beginning, with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, all the way through the Civil War, to the segregation era and Jim Crow, all the way to the present. Every time there's an opportunity, we reach these crisis points and black people say, let's do something, let's stop this, let's put an end to this, let's actually create a better, more just society. White people have done just the bare minimum to pacify us, or to prevent white people from getting too upset, and then go on all about their business and act like there's no crisis.
Right. And you mentioned history, and something else of a tactic that they're doing, especially now in politics, is the critical race theory conversation. And you actually worked alongside the founder, Derek Bell, who founded critical race theory, and you studied critical race theory as well. What do you make of this new conversation? And is enough being done to debunk this new narrative that's been taken over of what critical race theory actually is?
Well, no, I mean, what I make of it is it doesn't really matter what it is. If it's critical race theory or affirmative action or reverse racism or whatever issue that they want to come up with from time to time. It's all about scaring white people. I mean, white people are deathly afraid of any sort of uh, requirement to come to terms with the reality that they benefit from hundreds of years of white supremacy, slavery, segregation, and the vestiges thereof. And so anything that can keep them in denial, that can keep them ignorant of our own country's history, is celebrated. Anything that causes us to sort of think about race is problematic. Even though critical race theory, for the most part, has absolutely nothing to do with anything going on in public schools, because critical race theory started as a legal theory. Now, people say it's evolved since that time, but I studied critical race theory in law school, and it was something that you wouldn't teach in any K through 12 school in America,
Yeah.
because it's a very sophisticated legal theory, or a set of theories. But what has happened is that people who have no idea what critical race theory is have just substituted that term to suggest anything that has to do with teaching about race is problematic. Anything that has to do with public school students at the high school or secondary or primary level learning about America's history of race is critical race theory, and therefore it should be banned. And that's preposterous, but it's part of the long history of denial about white privilege. It's an attempt to capture or recapture a sense of innocence. And I talk about this in the book, why innocence is so important for white America. Because the reality is, white America, white people will never feel fully safe in this country until black people feel fully safe in this country. And that's something that they're not prepared to deal with. So what they've done is they've created all these systems. They've paid trillions of dollars so we can have the world's strongest, biggest military, and the world's biggest police force. So we can incarcerate more and more people. We incarcerate more people, more minorities in our country than any other country in the world.
Yeah.
And all this is just so white people can feel safe. And who are they afraid of? They're afraid of black and brown people. And so instead of spending all this money, hundreds of billions of dollars or trillions of dollars, on trying to protect white people from black and brown people, why don't we spend some resources and invest in creating a fairer, more just society? Why don't we make sure that people actually have jobs and health care and good schools to go to, and they can afford to go to college, and they can get affordable housing, and they have clean environments and safe drinking water?
Yeah.
Why don't we take care of the things that actually help people survive and have high quality lives, and that reduces crime. That reduces the need for having hundreds of thousands of police officers in the city, or having the world's largest military, because when you have social justice, you don't necessarily need to have that violence architecture that helps to perpetuate the state. So that would require people to sort of think from a long-term perspective instead of a short-term perspective, and that's really hard for some people to do. And the only thing that's going to, unfortunately, I think the only thing that's going to change that is when people realize that we've reached the point of no return and they have no other choice.
Exactly. And you talk about that in your book about the crossroads that we are here in America. And we see what's happening with the three white men on trial for killing Ahmaud Arbery. We see what's happened with the Rittenhouse and the judge, the way that judge is kind of, where he's acting and how that's playing out. This crossroads, what is it going to take for us to come out of this a better America after this reckoning?
Well, I don't think we've had a reckoning yet. I think maybe you're suggesting we're about to have one or something, and I think we may. But there was a lot of talk last year about a reckoning. But I think what we saw last year is that people were just embarrassed. They were embarrassed by the fact that Minneapolis police officers actually killed somebody, killed a black person in broad daylight, and they couldn't sort of sweep that one under the rug. In the same way that people were embarrassed in the 1960s when they saw the fire hoses being trained at young black kids, or the German shepherds attacking protesters, or John Lewis being beaten to a pulp at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. The tendency when white people are embarrassed by these things is to do something to stop the embarrassment, but not necessarily to stop the overall cause of the social injustice. Let's just stop. This is too embarrassing. We don't want to see that. So I think people responded by doing whatever was necessary to stop the embarrassment, and then they returned to their regular ways right afterwards. Which is the reason why you see a situation in Virginia why you can have one election where Trump loses in Virginia in 2020, then 2021, a Trump acolyte, if you will, ends up becoming the next governor of that state. And so the question is, how do we continue to fight that fight in a way that doesn't require us to give up? And part of it is understanding our own history. If you look back at Dr. King and Malcolm X, like I said, all those leaders from the past, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, whomever, there were millions and millions of people who were following them at any given point. There were just a small group of people. There might have been 100, 200,000, 250 at the March on Washington, but for the most part, Dr. King was marching with groups of dozens or hundreds at the most. And that's all it takes. Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, said, never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has, she said. And I think it's important for us to remember that we can't necessarily lose sight of the fact that we don't have to have everybody on board. We only need a few people who are willing to lead the fight, and other people will come along. But we can't give up just because everybody doesn't understand it. We can't give up just because white people are in resistance to it. We have to keep fighting that regardless of whatever opposition there may be, or however many numbers we may have.
Definitely. Now, when you hear, the Democratic Party and their messaging, this is all over the news right now, and how they're getting across their messaging. And then something that's scary to me, I saw a video with Steve Bannon saying he's going to capture, they have, the black males vote, and they're going to show up in all these large numbers. Is there a disconnect with the Democratic Party and black men?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think, Trump said the same nonsense when he ran for president. In 2016, he said, I guarantee you after 4 years, I will win over 95% of the black vote in 2020. He didn't come anywhere close. And what they said was, oh my God, he got 10 to 11% of black male vote. Well, I mean, black male votes have traditionally been much more up for grabs from party to party than black women's voters. And black women are the most loyal constituents in the Democratic Party. That's been the case for decades. It didn't change significantly in 2020 either. But there's also a certain element, I think, of patriarchy and sexism and misogyny within male communities, regardless of race. And we see that when you had a woman candidate in 2016 for president, and perhaps when you have a woman vice presidential candidate in 2020. On top of that, there are some messages that Republicans use that do appeal to Black men. The Black community is not monolithic.
Right.
I always tell people we're often politically progressive but socially conservative. You ask us about basic issues of equal rights, and we get that. We support that nobody should be discriminated against, that kind of thing. But when it comes to issues that we think are more social issues, gun rights or capital punishment, religion. A lot of Black people have much more conservative views when we look at those social issues,
Yeah.
and so it's important to make that distinction, and also to make the distinction for men and women within the Black community. But ultimately, it's astonishing to me that when the Democrats are winning 85 to 90% of the Black vote, 85 to 95% of the Black vote from election to election, that we think that the Republicans, by winning 5 to 10%, maybe even up to 11 or 12% of one segment of that vote, means that they are a danger. I think that's a misunderstanding. The Republican Party doesn't really offer much to the Black community.
Yeah.
And the Republican Party isn't offering, as far as I can tell, any solutions to what's going on in the world today. They're not offering any solutions to make wages increase. They're not offering any solutions to give people universal health care, reduce the cost of health care, or to lower the cost of prescription drugs. What are their solutions for how they're going to help people pay for college?
Yeah.
What's their solution for how they're going to make housing more affordable, or deal with climate change, or criminal justice? What are the only solution the Republican Party tends to offer? Two things: one, tax cuts, and two, fear. And tax cuts aren't really popular for everybody if you're not rich, because those tax cuts are usually supposed to trickle down to the poor. So they have to focus on fear for everybody else. Like fear of Black people, fear of brown people, fear of LGBTQ people, fear of Muslims, fear of Mexicans, fear of immigrants in general, fear of critical race theory, fear of the nanny state, of the people who are telling you to wear a mask, fear of the vaccine. All they have to offer is fear, because they don't have any solutions to anything. Now, on the other hand, the problem with the Democratic Party is that the Democrats have this constituency of Black voters, was, as I said, is the most loyal constituency in the party, and yet they haven't delivered for the Black community in decades. I mean, electing Barack Obama is not delivering for the Black community. And you look at where we are now, we have a Democratic president, a Democratic Senate, a Democratic House, and yet we can't pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. We can't pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. We can't even pass the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. Emmett Till was murdered August 28th, 1955. And here it is, all these years later, we still don't have a basic bill against lynching at the federal level. So what does that tell you about the effectiveness of the Democratic Party? And then they say, oh, well, we know we can't get it done because of the filibuster. And then even when we try to get something done, we have Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, the senator, holding everything up. I'm tired of all the excuses, man. Joe Biden ran as for president, saying that he had this ability to get things done.
Yeah.
Well, get things done. Put some pressure on Manchin and Sinema. Put some pressure on the Republicans. I'm tired of all the bipartisanship nonsense. I don't care if we get something done through a bipartisan method or a single partisan method. Yeah. As long as you get things done, and that's what I think Americans want. They want things done, and Black people in particular, they want things done. We want things done that actually benefit our community.
Yeah, definitely. Now, before I let you go, your book, Race Against Time, what do you hope after, someone reads it that they walk away with?
Well, I hope they walk away with two things. One, an understanding of the history that got us to this point, and why we are at this pivotal juncture in our country's history. And two, I hope they walk away with the evidence, the material, the faith, or the inspiration to do something about it. I think it's great for people to be knowledgeable, but I actually want people to do something. I want people to have this information so they can go and fight the good fights. They can, if they want to run for office, they can run for office. They want to be elected officials, they can be elected officials. They want to teach, they can teach. If they want to spread the gospel and tell the people about what's happening, they can do that. Whatever abilities they may have, whether it's politics, arts, culture, or however they may have some influence in the world with their family, their friends, their industry. I want people to read this book, use that knowledge, incorporate it in what they're doing, so that we spread that word, so that we can try to make change in this country before it's too late. Because my biggest fear, and I talk about this in the very end, is that we will mistakenly assume that the passage of time and the demographic changes that are taking place will inevitably create change in our country. And the reality is that's not guaranteed. As Dr. King said, time itself is neutral. He wrote about this in his letter from Birmingham jail. He said it can be used either constructively or destructively. And my biggest fear is that we're just going to, that not we, but some of us will assume that because all the old people are dying off and the black and brown populations are growing and the white population is dwindling, we can just sit back and wait for a few decades and it'll all work itself out.
Yeah.
There's no guarantee that's going to happen. It could easily fall to an entirely different direction, and we could have a collapsed state, we could have a race war, we could have a civil war in this country. So I'm hoping that people see this as a moment where they not only understand the challenges before us, but they do something to meet those challenges.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, Keith, like I said, I know you're busy, but I do appreciate you taking the time out just to talk about your book and just other things that's happening in this country. I definitely, again, appreciate everything you've been doing throughout your career. I watch you all the time when you pop up on CNN and, you talk. Do you have a podcast?
I do not. People always ask
Okay.
me about that, but
I
I
think,
don't
yeah.
have one. Yeah. I'm not a very good podcaster, I think, but maybe some point in the future.
Okay, yeah, because I was like, I would definitely be tuning in every time a new episode drops because what you have to say is definitely meaningful and the challenges that you kind of help us think better. So I do appreciate it, and hopefully I see you soon. And thank you again for talking with us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I enjoy the
Of
conversation.
course, great, great. See you.
Okay, bye bye.